Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced with another video in this introduction to React in 2024. And in this video, our second video, we're going to be going over the concept of props. Now, props are a way that components in React can pass information to each other. Okay. And again, just so you know, I own this website, devnursery.com. Check it out, docs.devnursery.com. You'll find lots of great resources, including a whole section on React. Okay, so if you go over here, you'll find sections on all sorts of different topics. Actually, click right over here. Okay, and then we have a section on React right over here. Okay, with all sorts of information. Okay, just so you're aware of that resource. But let me head over to Excalibur for a moment. Okay, and we'll use this image right here. Why not? Okay, so essentially there are two types of information. I will go back to this image again in the next video. There are props and there are state. Okay, we're going to be focusing on props in this video, but props are data passed from the parent to the child. Okay, so again, you have to imagine all your components like a tree in the sense that, you have your root component, which typically would be your app component, and then you have the components you use in there, and then the components that are using those components, and it becomes like a tree going down, okay, with all of its leaves. So a parent component can pass down data to its child component, and that type of data is called props. Later on in the next video, we'll talk about state, which are internal pieces of data that can be used. Okay, but with that, let's actually see props in action. So once again, I have a copy of the template, and again, you can always find a copy of the template here in this template folder. You can find this repo by clicking on the video description, and you'll find all the resources for my videos in there. And let's go to props. So I got everything all set up. I'm going to open it with live server so we can see the page over here. And again, it's just going to be an empty page right now just with hello world. Okay, and first let's just show you a basic example of how props works. So here I have my components. And again, basically a component is just a function that returns JSX, which JSX is that funny HTML-like syntax. That Babel will then in turn turn into the equivalent JavaScript under the hood, but luckily we don't need to do that ourselves. We just write HTML. So let's imagine I create another component called child. So function child. Okay. Now what's going to happen is that every component can receive one argument, and generally we call that argument props. Okay. Okay, so it's going to receive props, and what we're going to do is we want to see those props, so we're going to say console.log props, so that way you can see props. Let's see what that is. So here we're just going to return the h1 of hello world now. Okay, and then I'm going to use that component here. Okay, so I can just now child. Bottom line is that long as the function is in scope, I can now use that function kind of like this. Okay, that's basically the idea with React. React is very built on the concept of scope. So I highly recommend that, if your JavaScript fundamentals, particularly like understanding of how functions work and understanding of how scope works in JavaScript, okay, could be more solid, focusing on making that more solid first. It definitely makes a huge difference in sort of thinking through your React code. Okay. But bottom line is this. So basically what would happen, again, if we go back to our app.js, we mount the app component to our root, which is that one component or that one HTML element that has the ID of React. So what it's going to do is that it runs the app function, okay, which is defined over here. And then the return value gets put in that spot, which is child. Well, child has an uppercase C, so React would realize this is a component, look for a child function, run that function, and then replace. Then that would return h1. And then that's how that hello world is getting there. Now again, I'm console.logging props. So I should see something in my console. So I'm going to open up DevTools, and in the console I see this object. So this must be our props, because I can see this is the console log from line 6, which is right here. Okay, line 6. So if I open up that object, right now I see nothing. So right now there's nothing in that object because we haven't passed out any props. So how could I send props from app? So let's pretend that like app has a variable. We'll create a variable called const cheese equals Gouda. Okay, if I wanted to pass down this prop in the actual component tag, in the opening tag, okay, what I would do is I would put, you could give the prop any name. So we'll say cheese. And then if I want to assign it the value of a variable, I use curly brackets. And I can say, hey, I want this prop to equal the value of the cheese variable. So now when I look inside the object at console log props now, okay, I can see that I'm receiving that cheese prop. Okay, so you see props are defined like this, kind of like attributes in a normal HTML element. Okay, so pretty straightforward. Okay, and then again, I can just use that. So I can just go over here in this component now, and now I have access to that props object. So I can be like props.cheese, and see, now it says Gouda. Even though I never actually defined Gouda in this component, because app passed the value of cheese to child, this function now has it. Okay, and we can have multiple children. So let's say I put this in a div. Okay, and I'm going to move this copy of the child component in here. And again, components can be reused. Once you make a component, you can use it as many times as you want. So I could be like child cheese equals Munster. Okay, child cheese equals white cheddar. Okay, and we can see all of them are going to render right over here. So you see, for each child component, it's going to run the child function, and for that run of the function, props is going to have that version of cheese. So you can see here it's console logging cheese each time that function runs, and each time it's having that particular version of props. The cool thing about props is that it allows us to make very customizable functions, because we can pass down things that we don't know yet that we may want to pass down, whether it's information we want this component to display, whether maybe it's properties that we want to use to style it. Okay, so for example, let's pretend that I want to use what's called an inline style. So in React, you can do inline styling. What you do is you add a style prop to any element, HTML or component, particularly HTML. And then what you do is you pass an object. Okay, so see the purple curly brackets, that's because we're interpolating in JSX. So we're injecting a value. And then the blue curly brackets is the value we're injecting, which is an object. Okay, and that object can have any CSS properties that we want. So for example, I can say color, equals props.color. Okay. Cool. And actually not equals, because it's an object, so it'd be colon props.color. So now what I could do is I could go in here and start adding a color prop. So we'll say, hey, the first one I want to be blue. And see, now that one's blue because, again, it receives this color prop, and then we use it to style that H1. Okay, so again, you can make these customizable. That's the beauty of props. It allows us to pass information, which we can do literally anything with, and you can pass anything, not only just strings, but again, using the curly brackets here, I can pass in numbers, I can pass in functions, I can pass in literally anything that's a value. I can even pass in other JSX. Okay, so for example, well, first let's finish the color example. So color equals red. Okay, and color equals green. Okay, and see, now I have all sorts of different nice colored text over here, because again, each instance of the child component receives a particular color. Okay. And that's the beauty. I didn't have to write this component. I didn't have to write this H1. I didn't have to write all this many times, because I'm just able to reuse that component over and over again. That's the beauty of component-based design. We can create reusable building blocks. Okay. Cool. Okay, so that's what props is. Again, you can add as many props as you want. Now, a couple of tricks that you can use, like let's say you have a lot of props you want to pass in. Okay, so for example, let's say I don't want to necessarily like have to write all of this out. Okay, I could do the same thing. Let's say I create an object called props to send equals, it doesn't matter what the name of the variable is, but in here, what I'll do is I'll define, let's just say, hey, there's a cheese property that equals the cheese variable, and then there's a color property that equals blue. Okay, what I can do here is I can remove this. Okay, so I can remove the props instead of doing them each individually. And I can take advantage of a thing in JavaScript called the spread syntax, a spread operator, which what it does, it explodes an object. Okay, basically anything that's inside the object gets moved up one, in a sense. So essentially what I do is I use the curly brackets because that's how we inject variables in our JSX. And then I use dot, dot, dot. That's a spread operator. And we put the name of the object, props to send. So what that does, that ends up being the same as me writing cheese equals cheese and color equals blue, because what it's doing is taking those individual properties from the object and putting them there. Okay, if you only have like 2 or 3 props, I would just write them in there like this. But you know, you might end up in situations where you're sending down like dozens of props. Okay, because you might have really configurable components that require a lot of settings. Okay, so syntax like this can make it a little bit cleaner to kind of send those settings down. Okay, so that's one way of doing it. Okay, and another thing you can do is that, you know, typing in props.color, props.cheese, this can get kind of tedious, right? Maybe I don't want to do that. A thing you can do is that here you can take advantage of a feature in JavaScript called destructuring, and I can destructure, meaning pull out the individual parts of the object directly from this parentheses. What I do is I just put a curly brackets here, because since it's the first set of curly brackets, it's the first argument. So what I'm saying is that I want to pull certain values out of the object that I'm expecting as the first argument. And again, in React, components are always going to receive that props object as their only argument. So then if I know what the name of the props are, I can be like color cheese. And if I do that, now I can just get rid of me saying props. Get rid of this, props doesn't exist anymore. Okay, and now it works. Okay, and see, now I've just simplified what I have to write. I don't have to write props.color, props.cheese. Okay, so that's another way to take advantage of props. Okay. Now there is one prop that doesn't get passed in like this. There is one prop that doesn't get passed in like this, and that is called Props.children. Okay. So I'm going to create another component called function display children. Okay. I'm just going to receive props. Okay. And basically what we're just going to return is a div with props.children in the middle of it. Okay, so we can show you what props.children is. Okay, so let's use this component once. So if I'm going to use props.children, then what I want is a separate opening and closing tag, not these self-closing tags that close immediately. Okay, so then in this case, what I'm going to want is something like display children, and see I have an opening and a closing tag, and now I can put in here h1 I am props.children, and see we see it, but the reason is because when you are the content between the opening and closing tag of a component, anything in the middle gets passed in as props.children. And just to demonstrate that, if I console.log props.children, so you can see it, okay, you see here, you get this weird object. Now these objects that look like this, these are called React elements. Essentially all that JSX we've been writing gets broken down into these objects, these React element objects. Luckily, we don't have to know that because JSX and Babel are taking care of that for us. We just write HTML, and then Babel's translating all that into these React elements, okay? Making it easier for us to work with React. If there wasn't JSX, then React would actually be very painful to work with and not very intuitive. Okay, so JSX, that suddenly makes it make sense. Okay, but you see, bottom line is this, and then now I could again do another display children. Okay, and I'll do like an h2. It says I am also a child. Okay, we'll see that, and there it is. Okay, but again, the only reason they're displayed is because the display children component displays them. For example, if I were to remove this, so if I just click here and just turn that off, they're both going to disappear. Okay, just because they're here doesn't mean they show up. They only show up because now anything in between again gets past the prop. Okay, so then it's up to that component to then choose how to use that prop. Okay, and that's called props.children. So props.children is the only prop that doesn't get passed in this way. Otherwise, all your props get passed in this way. Okay, cool. So again, takeaways. Any component can receive props, but the only way it receives props is by putting them in the opening tag. Okay, so by putting it in the opening tag. So if you had a closing and opening tag like this, you would put the props here, okay, in the opening tag. But if you do separate the opening and closing tags, anything in between gets passed in as props.children, which you can do with what you want. Okay. Next, you can do inline styling. So if you wanted to just style a one-off element in your JSX, you could do something like this to style it. Okay, so you can just pass in an object that dictates your styles. So that's a thing you can do. Very useful when you're passing in props to customize the styling of the element. And yeah, but props can only go from parent to child. The child cannot pass props up. But what can be done, okay, so we'll just show one more thing. Okay, const send variable to parent. So what you do is if you want to send a variable up the component tree, what you do is you create a function. Okay. So we'll say this function receives a thing. Actually, what am I doing? Equals the thing console.log the thing. So now what I could do is I can send this component. I can send this function down to a child. So I can say, hey, we'll say send equals send variable to parent. So I send this function down as a prop. Okay, I can send variable to parent. Then in the child, I can just say something like props.send. And again, notice I'm using send because that's what I called the prop. The prop was named send. That's what determines its name in the props object. So then I can call it and pass it the value of 1. Okay. And you see 1, 1. It's logging this thing. But the logic of what I do with that number is happening up here in the app component, which means the other variables that are in the app component are now in scope. Okay, so that's one way to get variables that naturally probably wouldn't be in scope at the same time to be in scope at the same time. Okay, so again, props can only be passed down. So when you need data to go up, what you do is you pass down a function. Okay, so you pass down a function, and then basically what you do is you write a function that does the thing you want to do, minus the thing that you don't know yet. Okay, you make that an argument, and then you pass that function down, and then that function lower in the component tree can then pass that value to complete the logic. Okay, so again, I can take a function and pass it down to a child, like I did right here, pass it as a prop, and now this function over here could now use that prop. Okay, so yeah, that kind of gives you a good idea of all the different ways you can use props. But again, my name is Alex Merced. Again, if you like the video, hit like, hit subscribe. Best thing to do is just kind of get hands-on and try this stuff out and play with it. It becomes much more apparent as you try different things out and try to break it. But yeah, so that's React. So that's one way to share information between components is through props. Okay. Generally, that should be the only way you share data between components in these early stages. In the future, we'll talk about something called context, which will be another way, but we'll cross that bridge. So I'll see you there.